as said in marketing, finding insights is the most difficult thing to do. So it's easy when you have it, then it translates and then it travels and great. But finding insights is the most difficult thing to do. Now, of course, when we find it, then of course magic happens. People will see you, will notice you, will like you, will love you, and will choose you over and over. And that's of course what we are about in marketing, right? So here is a question for you. The second question: do you have a specific tangible example where you found a powerful insight that you're proud of, and how did you go about that? So that's your question on insights, because if that's the holy grail, how do we get to that?
So I think the secret statement I want to leave behind on finding insights, right? And this is much more important in the context of all of us in marketing who work on brands globally. So maybe you don't belong to that market or that country, or you're designing things which have to translate across the world. It could also be because you're designing or working or leading products or brands where you are not the consumer. Yeah, it could be a different age group, a different demographic, or a product segment which you may not necessarily use experience. So I think the trick there for me, and I truly tell myself this every day, is when you're sitting in a meeting room, when you're making a marketing mix, you are the voice of the consumer. You are the voice of the consumer, but you may not be the consumer. And I think that's very critical for you to absorb. And what I mean by that is, the minute you put yourself as the consumer of the product or service you're designing, you start bringing in all your own biases and your own lenses as an individual. Now, it's possible that you're working on a product or a service which is exactly designed for a target group like yourself, which is great, but that's going to be a very tiny set of people who have that opportunity. For a much wider set of folks, it's going to be that you represent the voice of a consumer. And to represent that voice, you really have to tell yourself, you know what, I don't know. And hence, I'm going to keep my eyes open, my ears open. I'm going to constantly have conversations about my product category and about my product in the life of the consumer. And hence, identify what really works for him or her. And from there, let me tell you the insight treasure hunt. And I'll use an example. Many of you will be familiar with the category of fabric conditioners. Yeah, that's where me and Anne had worked together many, many years ago. And I was tasked with the project to launch fabric conditioners in India for Unilever. And the interesting, or rather challenging problem statement was the company had tried to launch it about 3 to 4 times in the market already, and it hadn't done well. And I put up my hand and said, you know what, let me try and figure this out, because I had experience of using it when I lived in Bangkok for a short while. And it was an amazing product. Now, the context of this product category was it was advertised as a product used to give softness to clothes. So and the visual device on communication was these nice fluffy terry towels where the bottle would kind of bounce off it, and you'd show how it's really soft after using it, which was all great and worked very well for the brand, but it wasn't working in the Indian market. And what I then did was to step back and said that let's begin with the product and the consumer's life. We took a whole bunch of products and gave it to consumers with a bunch of usage instructions. You know, this is what you need to do. This is where you need to put the product in, and that's about it. And we'll come back after about 2 weeks and see what your experiences were. Now, the fantastic eye-opening insight, like what Anne now says, and post facto, it looks like, oh yes, was not a single one of these people talked about how it makes the clothes so soft. Many of them did not even recognize it as a benefit. Now, the challenge was not that the product wasn't delivering. The challenge was because in the Indian market, folks don't use terry towels. Folks at that time didn't wear tougher fabric like jeans, etc., because it's a hot and humid country. So very light, very airy fabric. So the benefit of softness wasn't even apparent to them. And we were then giving out a product with that benefit. Now, okay, that's great. That's not working. But what do you do Like, how do you actually come up with the product insight that works? In the conversations, when you were sitting with the consumer, talking with her, etc., homes in big cities in India are typically quite small, very humid, very tightly packed. I could actually smell the fragrance of the fabric conditioner in the house, because you'd have a clothesline, it'll be drying outside, and it'll kind of waft into the room. And that's where the insight was. The consumers really loved the fragrance, because in the hot and humid conditions, that benefit of fragrance was a very big standout. And it didn't just appeal to themselves as consumers. Often it was the women who did all the chores. So the husband went off to work and he wasn't involved in the laundry process. And it was a drudgery kind of a task. Nobody ever told you, hey, you know what, you washed the outfit really well. But now people were coming back, be it the husband, be it the kids, and saying, you know, Mama, what did you use? My clothes really smell great. Yeah. And there was a huge joy that this lady was getting for a very drudgery filled task because of a product benefit, which was so apparent. Now, in international markets, this was probably less relevant because people layered on deodorants and perfumes and fragrances, etc. But in this market, it made a huge impact. And I'm going to touch upon one more little tiny piece, which is very interesting. But this tells you what the consumer can tell you. These same consumers are also telling us that, you know what, when I wash my clothes, typically they lose their kind of new look very easily. But when I've used your product, they look like they're staying newer for longer. And they kept telling us this. And we went back to the research and development department and asked them about it. And most of them were saying, like, you know what, no, not really. But we then just kept at it, saying that's not possible. A lot of consumers are playing this back as a benefit. And then we dug deeper into the science behind the product. And we figured out it's a little bit like hair conditioners, where your hair opens up when you shampoo it and the conditioner kind of pushes it back. The same thing happens with the fibers on your clothes. They kind of open up when washed, and with the conditioner kind of lubrication, it goes back down. So it does maintain the clothes look for a slightly longer period of time. Now, this is on a product category which Unilever was selling for, I don't know, many, many, many years. And it wasn't discussed or talked about at all. But simply because we went back to the consumer on first principles, observed them in their real life context, we came up with these new insights, which we then put together, created communication, built a brand proposition around that. And today it's one of the largest, most successful, highest gross margin driving categories for the Unilever business in India. And I've lived to tell a story of success. So yes, that's the story I'd like to share.
Yeah, lovely. And it's great that you picked out a category where at least I can relate to. I hope that you see how Meghna kind of explains how the product works, etc. It's really about understanding consumer, understanding your product, and even learning from your consumers what actually your product is doing. Is a pretty amazing story. And I think the underlying story here, or the advice, of course, is when you're looking for insights, you cannot just look at your research and your data that you get on your desk. You can't just be an armchair marketeer. You need to go out, be with the consumer, live with the consumer, experience what they're experiencing. And that's where you get the powerful nuggets.